And we are here with George Gallup, and we're going to get to the official name in just a second, but this is Wednesday, 18th of May, 2011, and we are talking with Mr. Gallup here about his background, his history, and the history of his father, and the Gallup poll. First off, George, back to your name. This has always been confusing to me about exactly who you are. Sometimes you're called George Gallup Jr., but I understand you're really the third. Is that right?
That's correct. I'm confused about it too, but I am the third. My grandfather was George H. Gallup, George Henry Gallup. My father was George Horace, but we figured since there was an H in there, why not, get the line going, royalty and all that, But so I'm junior. I've been junior in the business world because to show that I'm my dad's son and not grandson, and but I'm still junior. I always will be junior. That's the way I want it.
All right. Well, we'll just call you George.
Or Junior.
Okay, or Junior. And background-wise, we're going to go through and talk about your father and his background and all that. But you came into this world when?
1930 in Evanston, Illinois. My dad was at the Medill School of Journalism. He was served actually as head for a brief period of the department. And so that's when I was born, when he was at Medill.
All right.
At Northwestern.
All right. Yeah. But backing it up before that, your father, we call him Dr. Gallup, was an Iowan. Tell us a little about that. He was born and raised and went to college in Iowa before he left. Is that right?
Yeah.
Give us a little of the background.
Absolutely. Well, the family, actually, his ancestors moved from the Middle West out of New England. I mean, it was a common pattern of migration, and went to actually to Illinois and thence to Iowa back in the middle of the 1800s. And so Jefferson was established in the early part of the 1800s.
Jefferson, Iowa.
I'm sorry, Jefferson, Iowa. So that was my dad's home. And my mom actually is from Iowa too, Washington, Iowa, a town of about the same size. And they met at the University of Iowa. But my dad has a long record at the University of Iowa as a professor and a teacher, and started the Daily Iowan as an undergraduate, taught there, and there's a chair in his name in the Department of Journalism. And so he has strong Iowa roots for sure.
What county is Jefferson in?
Jefferson's in Greene County.
All right. So he, as a young man, grew up in Jefferson. Was it a tradition to go to the University of Iowa? Was he the first one in his family to go to college?
No, actually, the tradition of Iowans in those days, a tremendously high percentage of Iowans went on to college. It's a highly literate state, and it still is, actually. Something like 90% of the kids in his high school went on to college. And my dad was considering going to Columbia, but he because of financial reasons, he had to go to the University of Iowa.
And what did he major in? Well, you said he was involved in the newspaper, but was he journalism? Was he psychology? They didn't have polling majors, obviously, back then.
No, it was actually in the Department of Psychology, because they hadn't started a journalism department. He actually helped start the Department of Journalism at the University of Iowa.
Was that his first love, journalism?
Yeah, I would say absolutely. He wrote a terrific paper when he was a youngster at Jefferson High School, and he was on the paper, student paper, and he wrote an article that was very insulting to the faculty, and his father chastised him for that, but said, "But you ought to be a journalist," and that planted the spark. And so he was on a strict journalism route all the way through the University of Iowa, and became the editor, summer editor of the paper, and then the full-fledged editor of the Daily Iowa, and then changed the Iowan from a weekly to a daily, and that's the way, of course, it is now. And he brought in a lot of the wire services, and he turned it into a profit-making venture, which is very important to him because he was struggling financially. The family had become bankrupt actually at the time of the stock market crash in 1919, and so he had to really struggle. But he turned it into a really going operation, actually.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Tell us again, your father was born in what year?
He was born in 1901.
1901.
In Jefferson. The house is still there. It's been fixed up recently, and it looks great. There's a dedication last fall.
Now, he stayed at Iowa directly. I know he went on to graduate work there. Tell us a little about that. Did he leave
We
and
stayed
come
on
back?
briefly for a year or so, did graduate work and taught there too. And then he was called to Drake University in Des Moines to head up the journalism department. And from thence to the Medill School at Northwestern.
But his Ph.D. came at what time, from where?
PhD came from the University of Iowa.
Okay.
Actually, yeah.
In?
Well, it was actually not in journalism, psychology, but a big part of what he was doing, of course, is related to journalism and to research, of course.
Tell us
advertising
about,
research.
Yeah, that's fascinating. He was a journalist, but obviously at some point he moved into the research realm. Tell us what you know about that. How did he morph from journalism into research about journalism, and then, of course, research about everything?
Yeah, yeah. Well, actually, I think he started really thinking about even polling as early as 1926, actually. And so he did some work for the Des Moines Register, helping the newspaper, better understand itself. And that sort of developed into working on advertisements and seeing how, people responded to ads. And then in that process of doing that, he developed the sampling procedure. And the big change that he brought about was encouraging the interviewers to go right to the people being interviewed and check the pieces that are read in the paper. Up to that time, it was, just the testimony of people. Oh, I read the headlines, and all of that. Mm-hmm. But he took the paper right to them, door to door. So in that process of trying to get accurate information from the newspapers, and specifically the Des Moines Register and Tribune, he would actually go right to the respondent, and he developed the sampling procedures out of that and realized that he started to move toward getting a better and better sample of the populace. And then he became keenly interested in politics because my grandfather ran for governor of Iowa and lost. He ran as a Democrat, came very close.
What was his name?
Alex Miller. He was a well-known political figure, as was his wife, Ola, who became Secretary of State, actually, a number of years later. But my dad got very interested in politics at that point. And so he describes the idea of the poll from as sort of spontaneous combustion. I mean, there were certain strands leading to that, coming to that development. But it was sort of, he says, a spontaneous combustion of journalism and advertising research and politics, those three things coming together. And when my grandmother ran for Secretary of State, he did some polling on her race.
Really?
Yeah. And actually got very close to what she actually did get and predicted a win for her. And she had a razor-thin victory.
What year would that have been?
That was 1932.
Was that his first political poll, as far as you know?
It was absolutely the first. The first ever, I imagine, in this country, following scientific sampling methods, yeah. And she made history because she was the first Democrat to reach high office in many years in Iowa. First woman ever to be Secretary of State, as far as we know. And so that was quite an incredible breakthrough. And then she went on to win ever larger margins in the subsequent elections for Secretary of State, and developed the state police in that state, and was responsible for a lot of the safety measures that are now routine in this country, and saved a lot of lives on the highway. So she's very revered in Iowa, as a matter of fact. Yeah.
So your father's first polling of some sort was market research for newspapers.
Yeah,
Iowa.
advertising research.
And his first political poll was for his mother.
Yes.
Is that who it was?
Exactly. That's right.
Was that his mother?
His mother-in-law.
Mother-in-law, excuse me,
yeah.
who ran for Secretary of State.
Correct. That's right.
Back it up chronologically a little. He got his Ph.D. at Iowa, and then tell us where he went from there.
From there, he went to Drake University as head of the Department of Journalism, and was there actually only about a year. And then a friend of his, Harold Anderson, who later sold the Gallup poll, became a partner with my dad in selling the poll rather, and encouraged him to come to Northwestern, as did the president of Northwestern, and to come and head up the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern.
And he did.
So he was there, and he did, and was there for about a couple of years.
That's most memorable because you were born there.
That's right. That's why I brought it up there.
Yeah, but he only stayed there a couple of years. Tell
That's
us
right.
why.
Well, Raymond Rubicam heard of his work in advertising research.
Raymond.
Rubicam, I'm sorry, of Raymond Rubicam, the advertising agency. Yeah. Young and Rubicam. And asked him to come east to head up the firm. The research department of that, because he had heard of my dad's work in advertising research. My dad had made a very important speech in New Orleans. He didn't think so at the time, but it was on the importance of research for advertisers.
What was the occasion for that speech?
Well, it was, I don't know the sponsor. I think it was a newspaper, but I think it was in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and it made headlines, and it certainly made headlines in the advertising circles. And it was, there were a tremendous number of requests for it. Several advertising agencies wanted my dad to consider coming east to head up the department, and Rubicam was most vociferous about this. He really was eager to get my dad, and came out to Iowa to try to enlist him.
So when did he move to Young and Rubicam then?
1932 he started.
So he left academia.
Yes, he did, but not completely, because he continued to teach journalism at Columbia University every couple of weeks or so. So he kept his hand in teaching.
But he moves to the commercial sector.
That's correct.
Advertising.
That's correct.
And he was responsible for what at Rubicam's firm?
Well, developing their advertising research program, and in terms of measuring, noting what people were following in advertisements and what makes a good advertisement, really. And that became much more increasingly sophisticated, with the result that Y&R did very well in their sales, in their promotion for helping products and so forth. But he developed that. He was there for about 15 years and did a lot of good work in the area of advertising research. Learned a lot more.
Interesting.
Yeah.
The firm Gallup and your father and yourself are associated with Princeton, where we are right now. He was working in New York. Where did the connection with Princeton come from?
Well, some friends of my dad's invited him to come down from New York. We lived in New Rochelle, and to look at a farm. And my dad reluctantly came down to look it over with my mom. And this is back in 32 or 3. And so they came down and checked out this farm, and it was a beautiful farm. And my dad, has farmer's blood. He was raised on a farm, actually. And so they both fell in love with it immediately. It was a place with bad shape and so forth, but Mom saw a lot of potential in it. And so the next Monday after this weekend, when they came down, they put a bid in, and it was accepted. And I think he got the whole place for something like $70,000, and there were 250 acres and a house and barns and everything.
Jeez. Now, this was the Depression.
This is the Depression, yeah.
So Princeton was where he lived, but didn't work, at least initially.
Well, he was looking around for a place to locate the pole, with a post office, obviously, and so forth. And Princeton was the nearest, the obvious choice, and that's the reason he chose it. Some people have thought over the years that he chose it because it has an academic ring, therefore it'd be a nice date line. But it was simply because that was close to his home, and so that's how it came to be in Princeton. But he did both things at the same time in the 30s. He worked at Y&R as the research director, and of course directed the Gallup poll, which was founded in. First release was in October 1935.
So he used to remember as a child he would get on the train, commute to New York like so many others?
Yeah, and ran the Gallup poll on the train in a way. I mean, he did both jobs, 2 hats.
And by the way, you live today on that farm.
Well, yes, I'm a squatter in one part of it, exactly. Yeah.
All right, and the family still owns it and lives on it?
No, unfortunately, the family doesn't own the original place. But I'm on the periphery of the first farm, the original.
Excellent. So tell us, you mentioned the Gallup poll. So we have this fascinating man, Dr. Gallup, who's working at Y&R in New York City, helping them with advertising research. How did we get to the point where there was something called the Gallup poll?
Well, the Gallup poll is a name that came along a little bit after the original name, which was the...
All right, back on the video, go ahead.
So to pick back up again, we have your father working at Y&R, advertising agency in New York, commuting in, helping them with advertising research. How did all this morph into what we now know as the Gallup poll?
Well, he actually, while at Y&R, he had been considering starting a national poll. I mean, those thoughts occurred to him right after the 1932 election of Ola Babcock, his mother-in-law, who won Secretary of State role.
Because that was his first taste of polling.
That's right, exactly so. And so he thought, of course, well, this would be great not only to poll about a political race, but about the issues, too. And in fact, that had been in his thinking earlier, too. But it came to a head then. He said, wow, this might be a great column, you know, to have in newspapers around the country. And he was greatly encouraged by Harold Anderson, who became his partner in selling the Gallup poll to leading newspapers around the country.
Who was Harold Anderson again?
He was the head of Publishers Hall Syndicate in Chicago, and would encourage my dad to think of the poll as a column in newspapers, and he was eager to sell it, and so he urged my dad along that route. But my dad had come to the conclusion that, you know, the polls could cover everything, every topic. And he really, I think he got his early encouragement with that when he was polling people in Iowa City to see if how they'd feel about moving from a weekly to a daily newspaper. And so that could be called the first on-the-street poll, maybe. And so, but his dictum was always, you know, if you want to know the answer, ask people, you know, a dictum overlooked sometimes. And so he was very enthusiastic about starting the Gallup poll and to newspapers and sending the column to newspapers around the country. So a lot signed up, actually.
About what? What time was this?
This is 1935. So he was ready to launch in that fall, in October.
Were there other national polls at that time? There were a few other pioneers in addition to your father.
Oh, yes, there were, yeah. Namely, Elmo Roper and Archibald Crosley. Elmo Roper had started something called the Fortune Poll and had actually come out with their first report a few months earlier, that same year. But it was mostly on business matters, and it was not as broad in coverage of different issues and so forth. But he actually, that report did come out a few months earlier. That's right. Then Archibald Crosley came on the scene with the 1936 election next year.
So it was an idea whose time had come.
That's exactly so. And I think, right, all of the timing, all the forces in society were, you know, ready for this to happen. And also I think the country didn't have a sense of identity, too, who they really were. And they were, you know, distressed and even flirted with authoritarian regimes as a way out of the Depression. So this is a very timely indeed time. And as my father's the first to say that, you know, he didn't invent the poll, although some people say he invented it. He said, you know, as with all inventions, there are many minds working on it. But in a way, he brought it together in a very dramatic way with the vehicle of journalism, which, thank goodness, it was that vehicle, because that spread it out, the knowledge of polls, much quicker than if it had been, stayed in academia.
So he actually combined his two interests with the polling because it was syndicated. Tell us a little more about the mechanics of how this worked when he first started the poll. I understand he actually put pages together with pictures and all that, and gave them to newspapers, things along those lines.
Absolutely, yeah. And we used to have huge releases, and the sampling techniques he evolved somewhat. Initially, they were quota sampling, and that means that the interviewer picks a certain proportion of people in various occupation groups, but it's up to the interviewer to do it. XX% farmers, just find them anywhere, and that's not a random selection procedure, but it can be very effective and usually accurate. But then you may miss some variable. So as the shift came actually a little later after the '48 election. But in the early days, he would send his interviewers out to interview in person, and there were certain controls at that time. There were about 5 different controls in terms of region and age and sex and so forth. But he would cover every possible topic, and I think early on he was even thinking of polls abroad, because soon after he started in this country, he was talking to people in England about getting the poll going in England and in France, and in other countries actually too. And actually surveys were undertaken prior to World War II.
We think about a lot about elections, but what are some of the other things that he asked about in those first polls? In fact, what was the first question, as far as we know that he
First
asked?
question had to deal with the cost of the New Deal, and it showed that the public thought it was costing too much, and so New Dealers were furious. So right off the bat, there was a stream of criticism constantly, which whatever topic is polled on, as you well know, draws ire from some quarter.
Mm-hmm. But he would ask over the years questions about lifestyle.
Yes.
What are you doing these hot summer nights to cool off?
That sort of thing, sure,
Mm-hmm.
along with the heavy stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So he early on saw the tremendous potential to snoop in every area of life, really.
Mm-hmm. Now, 1936 election really kind of made him famous. Tell us what you remember or know about that.
Well, it was indeed time. It put the pollsters on the map, really, because the Literary Digest had the most famous poll, and they had a great record going up to that election. But they relied on their results on massive numbers of interviews. They went to 1/3 of all households in 1936, and the assumption was the more people you interview, it sounds logical, the closer you'll get to the actual results. But of course, that's not true if you don't have the right proportion in certain groups. So my dad, using a representative sample, as did Crosley and Roper, said Roosevelt would win. And my dad actually predicted how far off the mark the Literary Digest would be, and he was only 1 point off from that. So that helped bring about the demise of the magazine. There were other factors too. But that put the scientific pollsters, if you will, on the map, for sure.
He had the courage to put that out ahead of time. Now, the conventional wisdom said Roosevelt would get defeated because of, like, the Literary Digest poll. He had,
Right.
Was it courageous to go out and say, they're wrong, I'm right?
Absolutely. I mean, everything was on the line. And to say that they'd be wrong and tell them how much they'd be wrong by, was really insulting.
But it proved right.
It proved right,
Yeah.
yeah.
To move forward a little, at some point along here, your father got involved with Hollywood, right?
Yeah.
Tell us a little about that.
Early on, actually. He was only in his 30s. And the person that gave him the push was actually Nelson Rockefeller. He said, why don't you do surveys for Hollywood? And my dad...
Now, how did your dad know Nelson Rockefeller?
Well, he knew him early on because of a connection through Young and Rubicam and radio research. It's quite detailed, but my dad was a good friend of Nelson Rockefeller's, as a matter of fact, and Rockefeller suggested getting involved with Hollywood, and my dad sparked to it because people were saying, oh, you can't poll on movies, what movies people want to go to see, and so forth, and that was just enough to get him to do it. It was a challenge. And my dad did actually something like 5,000 studies for Hollywood on the plot line, the actors, the cast, the box office, how many people would go, and he said it was some of his very best research. It was right on the money. I mean, Gone with the Wind would look differently today if it hadn't been for Gallup research.
Tell us about that.
Well, we used something called a Hopkins televote machine. It's sort of like an electrocardiograph machine that goes up and down on a chart, and 60 people would have these little units, and it all feed into a main graph, and then you'd see the dips. People would turn at various parts during the movie, and the bad parts. When Selznick, who produced the movie Gone with the Wind, saw the low parts, he just took a ruler and just chopped them all off underneath there. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of pieces they're taken out of there, and It's a Wonderful Life was very much engineered, if you will, by Gallup. A lot of the pieces of it, and the titles were tested, the plot line was tested, the cast was tested. So a lot of those movies were manufactured by polling.
Did your dad get on the train and go to Hollywood and meet David O. Selznick? How'd that come about? He was in Princeton, not Hollywood.
Yeah, it was definitely train
But I mean, how did he meet Selznick? How'd this come about?
Well, through various other people introducing him, and he worked with an amazing guy called David Ogilvy, who later became the head of course, of his own advertising firm, Ogilvy and Mather.
During World War II, David Ogilvy was, some allege, spying for the British government.
Yeah. He had a connection with him, yeah.
But tell us a little more about that.
Yeah, well, he was a charming guy, and Oxford graduate, very attractive and very articulate, and so he sort of dazzled the Hollywood types. And they're very impressed, as Ogilvy would point out. He said they're very... they wondered why Dr. Gallup had a male secretary, and Ogilvy said, well, if a man has a male secretary, that's particularly impressive, you see, and particularly if he has an English accent. So that's what he theorized.
So how did Ogilvy meet your dad?
That meeting came about actually quite a few years earlier. Ogilvy had run into my father at a conference. And the actual, when they came together and started discussing things, I can't put my finger right on the exact moment.
But Ogilvy helped him market to Hollywood.
He did. That was his thing. He headed up ARI. Though my dad oversaw the whole thing, obviously.
ARI meaning?
Audience Research Institute,
Was that cool to you? As a child, that your dad was out there in Hollywood?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And Walt Disney came to our house, and I'd peek through the door, and look at the inventor of Mickey Mouse. I mean, that was big stuff,
Yeah.
I was about 7 or 8 at that time,
Did your dad like that?
Like that research?
Hollywood work as opposed to polling for politics.
Well, he loved politics, actually, and was obviously very astute in the figures of... And but he also had a great kick working with the studios in Hollywood, and he thought some of his very best research was done for Hollywood, as a matter of fact. So yeah, he loved that period. I'm sure he did, and and then got to meet a lot of actors and actresses. And Hollywood was big stuff then. I mean, that was. There was one poll my dad cited that showed how much they liked. They said, if you had only 6 months to live, what would you do? And Pop expected people to say, well, I would give all my money to charity, or become a missionary or something. But it was to go to Hollywood and see the movie stars.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was so, the people were just wiped out by it. So I think if you look at some pictures of my dad talking to the actors, you can see that the Jefferson boy, sort of in awe of these great, these well-known actors and actresses, and so I think he got a huge kick out of them. Got to know quite a few of them. In fact, Loretta Young was one of our best friends, the family's best friends. Although my dad and my family met her through her husband when he was working in New York City in an advertising agency. So that was a different route. But he got to know quite a few actors and actresses.
That's fascinating. World War II. Did he poll a lot on whether we should get into the war or not, and things along these lines? And what did he do during the war?
Absolutely. Yeah, we polled on virtually nothing but during the war. But also, should we get involved in it? And of course, there's a strong isolationist feeling in this country prior to the war. And also about the threat of Hitler and Nazi Germany. And the public always seemed to be a little ahead of the government on that, in terms of wanting to move to a stronger Air Force, helping the British sooner than it actually happened and so forth. They seem to be ahead of the legislative leaders. And so, yeah, we a lot of polling on Hitler, and the public felt more threatened by Hitler than did the leaders, actually.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
He was still, at this time, young in Rubicon and running the poll. When did he finally quit his day job and go full-time polling with the Gallup poll?
With the Gallup poll, that was it was about 1949 when he started the Gallup in Robinson which is a company that measures the advertisements, the reaction to advertisements, and basically sort of what he was doing. But he combined forces with Claude Robinson, and that became a very big and successful operation. So he continued to do the poll and Gallup and Robinson at the same time.
Now, a year we all remember, 1948.
I can't quite remember.
Do you remember much about the fateful year for polling? Do you remember much about it personally? You were about
18.
18 at the time?
Well, I was at prep school, and I got the little ribbing up there from the
Where were
professors at Deerfield Academy. You know, and
Well, tell us what you know about it, because it was a bad year for pollsters.
it was a bad year for pollsters. My dad was, he took a tremendous ribbing, and I mean, almost brutal at times, but it never got to him really, because he knew that polling was here to stay. He knew what had gone wrong. He knew that there was no better system, and so he was he was never despondent. He knew that it would make it.
And how did he react? He as a scientist, I guess, he tried to figure out what went wrong, right?
That was his immediate reaction. He even left the New York City. He was on radio, and very early, before anybody, my dad said on the radio, it looks as if this is not going to go the way we thought it would. So he split with my mother out of their hotel that same night and said, I got to get back to Princeton and figure out what's going on here. So, like a true scholar, immediately plunged into the factors, possible factors.
What were the factors?
Well, there were a number of them. One of the key ones was stopping polling too soon and missing the collapse of the support for third parties. That usually occurs in every election, or has since the turn of the century. And in this case, it was a collapse of vote for the Wallace vote, Henry Wallace and Thurman. Both of their support fell down and went back to Truman in the closing days. That often happens, as you know, of course. It's the protest vote. The third party vote is a protest vote, and it goes back to the normal channels at the end of the election. That was one factor. Another was the allocation of the undecided. It was wrongly assumed that the undecided would split the way the decided went. It became apparent that, it became obvious that you can't say the undecided are more likely to go one way or the other. The safest route is down, split them right in half. So that was sort of a mechanical difference. But the big one was just stopping polling too soon. That was the really big factor.
Now, you mentioned earlier that was still quota sampling. You said he changed after that methods.
Yeah, that came about in 1950. We started to shift. But the 48 election wasn't the immediate impetus for that so much, because the quota sample had proved itself pretty well. But if we had been using the quota sample in 1960 when Kennedy was running, a Catholic, we could have been way off the mark, because we wouldn't have gotten the right proportion of Catholics. But now, with the random selection, all possible variables are taken into consideration.
Was the next election after 48 was 52, Eisenhower running against Adlai Stevenson. Was he trepidatious then about trying to predict? How scared was he?
Well, I think very scared. I mean, everybody was in the bowling field, and was tentative. But my dad insisted on, putting the figures out. Some pollsters sort of dodged by having a big fat undecided, saying they could say afterward, well, what happened was the last minute they shifted over, it'd be an escape hatch. But my dad never did that. He just put the figures right out there, broke down the undecided as much as he could, and that always got down to a very low figure. And so he insisted on that.
And he was right in 52.
He was right. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
The importance, we're talking about pre-election polls. Your dad felt that was important because it showed the world what polling could do. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. Polling, was sort of, as he used to say, the acid test of a poll's methodology. It was a real proof of, is this accurate? Can you really get honest opinions from people? And so it was a very good test, because there's turnout you have to worry about, there's undecided, there's so many other different factors, timing and all the rest of it.
So he spent all the way up to his death a lot of time on those presidential election polls because he thought they were important.
Yeah, on his desk at the time of his death, I saw some scribblings about it. Was the Mondale-Reagan race. I saw some scribblings that he had been doing that very morning he died, actually. So he was really a keen student of politics and the vote of every little county around the country.
Mm-hmm. Your dad felt polling was important for democracy, for society, did he not?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
That it was a, excuse me, a very useful instrument for democracy, extremely so. That, one, in a democracy, of course, the common person should have a say and be heard, not necessarily followed, mm-hmm. but heard. And so he felt that so keenly. I mean, he felt, he measured people in the aggregate, but he cared about them individually too, because he always saw tremendous potential in every person. And he wanted to bring that out, to have people be able to feel comfortable talking, saying what they wanted to and talking back to the government. And and also so the country could have a better sense of itself. Who are we as a country? Where do we stand? What are our values? So that was bone deep in my dad, the desire to help other people and that way give them their voice. And I think it goes back to high school journalism, to journalism at the University of Iowa, listening to people at all times. He was a great listener.
Was your dad a Democrat or Republican?
He's really neither, and I think that's legitimate. I mean, he didn't have a great deal of respect for people that would be lockstep Democratic and lockstep Republican. He felt that an intellectual should choose both, select from both positions on issues. He didn't think you had to be relentlessly consistent on them. And so he was an independent. As a matter of fact, his early voting is Democratic. He was very impressed with his father-in-law, Alex Miller, who ran as a Democrat because Iowa was all Republican, and he wanted to see a strong two-party system. Alex did, and that's why he threw his hat in the ring as a Democrat, although he had been a Republican. And my father voted for La Follette and also for Al Smith, two Democrats. Well, one was progressive candidate, and Smith was a Democrat, but that was his last actual voting. He didn't vote while a pollster because he felt...
Period. No vote.
Locally, always. Mm-hmm. And he felt very strongly that people should vote, but he exempted pollsters. He felt that, they should be referees, in this business. Really? And not...
It's a secret vote. Why would he not vote? Because no one would know how he voted.
Well, because reporters would come up to him and say, how did you vote? And he'd either have to lie, or if he said, well, I voted Democratic or Republican, which could have been, mm-hmm. they would have said, aha, we figured that,
So he just said, I don't vote.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now yourself, you went to Deerfield, then to Princeton. Mm-hmm. Were you interested in polling at Princeton at all? Did you
I always was, because my father, it was part of our lives. I mean, he would test questions out on us constantly. And yes, I was always interested in polling, but mostly interested in religion. I was thinking about going in the clergy and worked in a black church in Texas, in Galveston, for a couple of years, mm-hmm. with the idea of going to the ministry. But then I thought of my father's field, how I could relate to religion and help in finding out how people are responding to God, mm-hmm. To the extent that's at all possible. And so that became sort of a passion with me. And I'm always interested in the particularly the editorial aspects of Gallup. I mean, but I got involved in all areas. I mean, I did.
You came home to work in the family firm at some point?
Yeah, 1954 I started, and then I retired in 2004, so exactly 50 years. But I started at that point and did tons of interviewing, which I think is terribly important for a researcher.
And you went out into the field and knocked on doors?
Yeah, constantly. And getting the farm vote and that sort of thing, which mm-hmm. in those days was a big factor, was the farm vote. And we even had a vote to get the vote of eggheads. We call them eggheads. For Stevenson, they were mm-hmm. called eggheads. And so we went all over the country. I probably interviewed more than anybody in the world up to that point in America. Yeah. Constantly. but I loved it, and then writing up those reports, case histories and stuff. So that gave me a great kick, and then I always wanted to sort of dig deeper, if you will, into the spiritual underpinnings of attitudes and so forth, and find out what's going on in the spiritual life. So that was a constant interest of mine throughout my whole polling career.
Mm-hmm. Tell us a little about the mechanics. Today, a lot of interviews by phone on the computer, so data are available instantly. When you had interviewers all over the country, I understand you could still get those results tabulated pretty quickly. How did all that work with trains and all that kind of thing?
Yeah, well, it was rather slow initially. I mean, it was all by mail, slow mail basically. But they would call back the interviewers in a hurry. If they usually mail it back, the results. But if we were trying to do a so-called quickie, that they would telephone it back actually. But it was actually quite efficient. And then we started to use the telecopier back in the 70s, which was sort of state of the art then. Now it's passé certainly, but to send our reports to the newspapers. But even then we could turn around quickly if we had to. We'd tell the interviewers ahead of time we're going to be doing this, and then could they call the results back in.
Tabulation. By hand, card sorters, what do you remember?
Well, fortunately, the IBM sorter was invented at the time that polling came into being, so we used the sorter. But some methods still was using, I guess, the hollerith method and so forth, and sticking needles through the holes in the cards and so forth. But we made great use of IBM machines, of course.
Your father and presidents. Some people have looked back and said that there was some connections between aides to, say, Nixon and some others and your father. What do you know about that?
Well, my dad's whole approach was, separation. He didn't even accept invitations to go to the White House because he didn't want it, well, for obvious reasons. And sometimes a president's aide or somebody would want to know findings, and we steadfastly said, no, get it in the newspapers, when it comes out, that we can't, they're our clients. We're beholden to them. So, I mean, I guess it's hard sometimes to turn them down, but we felt that we had to do that.
Criticisms, you mentioned that earlier. It's your father spent a good bit of time defending polling, because there's always people who say either your poll's wrong or the poll in general is not a good thing. Yeah,
absolutely, yeah. No, it's true. He had to, and he did steadfastly too with articles and speeches and so forth. He'd always there'd be a defensive stand there to clarify stuff for the people. He felt that once people knew what understood it, that they would accept it. It would make sense, and so he did, and wrote a book called. What was it called now? On to answer all the basic questions that he collected all the basic questions that are criticisms are asked about polls, and put them in the book, which I have on my shelf, and I can't think of the name of it right now.
Yeah. I know what you mean there.
Yeah.
Poll
watchers. It's about poll watchers. Yeah.
The Poll Watchers Guide, or something like that.
That's it.
Close elections, like what do you remember? 1960.
Oh yes,
just like the 2000 race.
Yes, exactly so. That was extremely exciting indeed. So, and unnerving to an extent, but you can be statistically right but wrong with the results. But we had a slim edge for Kennedy. We could have easily gone the other way because of the sample margin of error. It's so close, but we had Kennedy winning. So. That was a big kudo for us.
He did win.
What?
He did win.
He did win.
It's in all the books.
Yeah,
that's true. That's great. A couple of things your father did. There's something called a quintimensional method.
Yes.
Do you remember that?
Sure.
Which I'm not sure really took off, but it's fascinating.
Well, it's a great method that should be used. It can be and is, of course, used today. It was invented or developed back in the late 40s by my dad. And it's trying to cover an issue in all dimensions. I mean, one of the criticism is that you just hit people with one question, and they don't have a chance to look at the nuances. But through the quintimensional plan of question design, there are 5 questions, and you ask people, have you heard or read about this? which is terribly important, obviously, and I think a lot of polls still don't do this right, excluding people who don't know anything about a particular issue, just getting the informed. Have you heard or read about something? Then they have to prove it. What can you tell me about this? Then they get the actual vote on the question. Then the next question is, well, why do you feel this way? And then finally the question is, how strongly do you feel about this? So in other words, you're getting a full dimensional picture on that question.
One reason it may never be used is that's a lot of questions.
No, and that's the reason, basically. You know.
He also did something with which we're involved in, a referendum, where you would get a list of issues and bang, bang, bang. Go right
My dad was always trying new things. I mean, I've written a list of ideas that just, page after page of some of them really quite interesting that never fully developed. But he wanted to simulate an election, so he had a ballot printed up that had it looked like it's a yes no. There was no place for no opinion on this particular one, and then he used this in barometer counties, and the reason was basically to grab the public's attention. And that was the basic reason. And he wanted to show that the election results can't always be interpreted in terms of issues, and they often are. They say so and so won, therefore they want to get out of the UN or whatever it is, but that's not necessarily the case. So he was trying to define the voting mandate before the election, saying this is what the election election tomorrow will mean in terms of issues. And he'd go right down the main issues that had already been pre-selected as very important. And so it would tell the listener or the viewer, this is what the election's all about. So don't misread one candidate's win for being for or against something. So I thought that was valuable to do that.
That was a yes-no question for those of us in the polling world. One thing we was remarkable about your father is he loved simple questions with simple answer choices, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. The difficult part with questions is you don't want to write a question that's too sophisticated or too difficult, complex for a person with the least formal education, but you don't want to insult somebody who is educated too. So it has to be, you have to think of both of those things. But the simpler the better, he felt, certainly. I mean, each side stated equally, clearly. And so I think he was very right in that department. I mean, I think a lot of bad stuff, some, has come about in polling because it gets so incredibly complicated and with subparts and all the rest of it.
One of the things along those lines your father's well known for is presidential job approval. How did that come about? Do you know from talking? I mean, that's still used to this very day. The same almost exact wording that your father evolved.
Right. Well, the initial questions were a little different with FDR. I think it's how, forget exactly, it was a favorable opinion or it wasn't quite the approval question, but the approval question came into being soon after, I think in the 40s. And my brother, Alec, late brother, wrote a great book on it, as a matter of fact, Presidential Approval. And it's fascinating to trace that and see how it relates to election returns and so forth, the vote, actually.
Indeed it was.
Yeah.
Was your father a workaholic?
Yeah, he was. Yes, he was. But a happy workaholic. He was not a grind, and suffering. And his life and his work blended. It was all of a piece. And his mind was constantly active and asking, how can you do this better? He was amazing that way. And he was a true intellectual. You don't find many around, but he used his mind. He enjoyed learning. He found it pleasurable, and he was a constant learner, a constant student. He describes himself as a student. That's the word he'd used to describe himself, actually. And his father was an interesting man too. He didn't indulge in gossip or socializing particularly, but studied the brain, phrenology, and all of that. And so that part was carried on to my dad for sure. And his mother was a wonderfully strong Christian woman, and those basic values were certainly imparted to my dad too.
He was not so much interested then in business, per se.
Not particularly. Not particularly, but he had an eye to the bottom line because he had to struggle so hard when he was in college to, pay the bills and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So he appreciated making a profit, and that he wasn't above not making a profit, but he didn't like the details, the business stuff.
Mm-hmm. What do you recall those years, 54 to 2004? You did almost a lot of interviewing, did a lot of other stuff.
A lot of interviewing, questionnaire design was sort of my thing in the early days, mm-hmm. And that went with pre-testing. I was always pre-testing questions. And then for a period, writing releases, always with him over my shoulder, saying, let me try a shot at this, George, taking the page out and retype. But, that was fun. And then, I worked with clients, too, market research clients a lot, too, over the years.
For example? You remember some of those?
Well, there would be probably nonprofit groups, actually, mm-hmm. mostly. Mm-hmm. And particularly with the Gallup Institute, which we set up at the end to pursue, trying to look at ideas, new ideas in society. And then we worked with a lot of nonprofits in that area.
If your father were alive today, what do you think he would want people to know about polling or public opinion?
Well, I would think he would certainly want them to appreciate what a poll, if well done, can do, that never lose sight of the fact that this is really, in effect, a poll is everybody in the country going to the polling booth, including non-voters, mm-hmm. and expressing their opinions, what they want to see happen in their lives, giving them a chance to express their hopes and fears about the future, really a voice in their own destiny, to hammer that home, that a poll is not just a poll, it's the people. Mm-hmm. And in a democracy, that's what you should care about.
You personally, you endorse those ideas?
Wholeheartedly, yeah, absolutely, yeah. And I think it's just thrilling the way Gallup has expanded around the world, giving virtually every person around the globe a voice in his or her destiny. Mm-hmm. There's just the voice not just lost in the wind, but it can count if leaders listen.
Should leaders listen slavishly and do exactly what the polls say?
No, and my dad never thought that either.
He didn't?
No, actually he felt that a leader's to lead, mm-hmm. and that they should not abandon his conscience just to, go with the poll and win votes. But that a leader would be foolish not to listen to the people because they're the people whom he's leading. And it'd be crazy not to, and not really fair not to listen to them. But if they felt differently, their job is to re-educate the public and not to jump on the bandwagon of the poll itself, the results.
Siblings. How many siblings did you have? Or do you have?
I had lost a brother, Alec, 2 years ago.
Who was very much involved in the company?
Very much involved, yeah, mm-hmm. absolutely. And younger sister.
Mm-hmm. Who was not involved in the company?
Not really, no.
Mm-hmm. No. Your father passed away in 1984. Tell us where he was and why he was there when he died.
Well, he was in his house in Switzerland, and it was a day like every other day, a beautiful day in Switzerland. And he loved Switzerland, and he liked everything about it. I mean, the food, the countryside, the cows, the mountain flowers, the government, system of government. He thought that their government was really very powerful very effective, mm-hmm. because there were 7 people that run the country, and one person selected each rotation to be the president. And most people don't even know his name, but he's one of a committee. So and there are times when I wish that this country were run by committee and not one person calling the shots. I think it'd be a little safer, frankly.
Mm-hmm. So he had a home there?
He had a home there, yes. Mm-hmm.
Where?
In Segersville, which is near Lake Thun, mm-hmm. not too far from Interlaken or Gunten. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And he just had a heart attack?
He had a heart attack, yeah.
Mm-hmm. That was 1984.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
All in all, George, this interview is going to be archived, mm-hmm. by AAPOR. So mm-hmm. for all we know, when you and I are long gone in 20, 30, 40, 50 years, there'll be young students and others who will be looking at it, trying to understand the pioneers, yourself and your father. What's important, let's say in 2060, that people remember about all of this? What would you say? Your father, the industry, things along these lines.
Well, that they remember that there was a great explosion of opportunity for people to get into the role of leadership of the country. That at last, after long last, the public was brought into the arena, the world arena. Up to then, they were not. They were not understood. They were not heard. They were ridiculed. But come mid-30s, all that changed in a most dramatic way, with people then now having a voice in their destiny and a voice in the world. And it elevated the common man. And so I think that was the wonderful achievement, really, giving the world back to the public and not just putting it in the hands of tyrants, really.
And your father should be remembered for that. If we remember George Gallup, Dr. Gallup, your father, we should remember that. On the cover of Time magazine, famous, very famous.
The man who gave a voice to the public.
That's great. Thank you very much.
You're welcome indeed.
George Gallup III or George Gallup Jr. How we want to look at it, George. Thank you so much.
You're certainly welcome. Thank you.
All right.